Good morning. Today we are going to talk about intensive point counts. Intensive point counts are surveys that we tend to do at restoration sites or another area where we need a lot of more detailed bird survey data. So where we are right now is the Simpson Restoration Site, which is an area that Tucson Audubon has spent many years restoring habitat in Marana. It's in the Marana area, and it's a City of Tucson property where we have done lots and lots of restoration work over the years, where we've planted lots of vegetation, put in raptor perches, some burrowing owl burrows, lots of restoration work over many years. So to monitor that work, we have done regular intensive point count surveys for all bird species. So this is the restoration site right here. We have 3 routes that we do. So we have a riparian route, which goes along the Santa Cruz River. We have a Northfield route, which is where we are located right now, here in the Northfield of Simpson. And then we also have a Southfield route. So this Northfield here looks pretty good. It's awfully green. We've had a lot of rain and lots of little plants coming up. Just for your reference, right now it is February. This is early February. We're doing our winter survey. These surveys we do quarterly. We do them as 3 teams, all on the same day. The 2 field teams each have a spotting scope, and that's fine. It's okay to use things like scopes on an intensive point count survey as long as you use it every time. So every survey, the Northfield team, the Southfield team have a scope, and the river team does not. Scope's not very useful up there, and that's all right as long as you keep it consistent. And that is the key to point counts, is keeping everything consistent. So starting, within a half hour of sunrise, just making sure each intensive point count is exactly 10 minutes. So consistency is key when it comes to point counts, and we have consistently used spotting scopes in these surveys. So we are moving on to our next point, and then we'll be talking about data sheets. Okay, so now we're doing an actual point count, intensive point count, which is 10 minutes. And we're just going to be filming here for just a few minutes of it, but we are intently observing. So we have a primary observer of Olea, who's operating as the primary observer, doing the calls as to what species we're seeing and how far away they are. It's very important to be vigilant during a point count. You want to be looking in all directions, listening intently. Some distant sparrows, and this is what we're using the scope for. We'll do a more intensive look at the data sheet in the next segment of this video. But the main things you need to be documenting and really watching for as a primary observer to communicate to your data sheet taker, the person collecting the data, is that you're in the first 5 minutes, 0 to 5, or if you're in the 5 to 10 minute time frame. That's very important as the primary observer. And the next most important thing is you're calling out birds for them to record is, what is the species? Was it audio or visual? Or both? How many there are? And it's okay to estimate. If you're not sure if it's a flock of sparrows ducking in and out of a bush, you can say, 10, and then check estimate. If you see 2 birds sitting together, you can get an exact count, that kind of thing. And then more important, also very important, is how far away they are. An intensive point count has much more narrow bands of distance. This is also something that can happen during a point count. You get disturbance, like this helicopter flying over. It's totally fine if it's disrupting your survey to pause time, ignore anything, and then start the clock again once that disturbance is out of the way. Okay, so we'd start time again now that sound has faded. So once you see a bird, you want to communicate to your team, to your person doing the data collection, the species, whether it was audio, visual, or both, how many, if it was an estimate, and then the distance. So distance is going to be much more narrow. You have 0 to 10, 10 to 20 meters is all in meters, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, and then it gets much wider, 50 to 75, 75 to 100, 1 to 125, 125 to 150. So you got to just go with your gut. Distance can be tricky. I suggest you practice distances in real life, especially in terms of like what 0 to 50 looks like. And then you can also record things like general behavior codes, breeding behavior codes, and we'll talk about that. But the main thing is to be very carefully observing in all directions, keeping track of the birds that you see in the 0 to 5 minute range, the 5 to 10 minute range. This can be a little tricky because 10 minutes in, you're not sure if that's the same burden as you had 1 minute in. You just got to be paying very close attention and keeping track. Okay, so right now on their point count, the first 5 minutes is up. So Olya is communicating that to the data taker. And now they're going to mark any birds after this as the 5 to 10. It'll be only new birds, new individual birds. All right. So in the next segment, we'll talk about the data sheet itself. So we have an actual point count happening right now. Olya on the left is the main observer. So she called out the time and began a timer on her phone. Very important to be looking in all directions and listening intently. You have to pay pretty close attention to get a sense of the bird you're hearing or seeing 8 minutes in is the same one or a different one than an individual of the same species you had earlier in the point count. So it gets pretty intense and you got to really pay close attention and listen because it's very possible for a second ladderback woodpecker, for example, to come in, but you have to sort of be keeping track of where things are and how they're moving around you. And if you're not sure in the field, you just got to go with your gut. No one in the office looking at a data sheet later will ever have as much information as you had in the field at that moment. So you got to make that decision if it's a new bird or the same bird, or what distance it is, or what species it is. So right now they're in the 0 to 5 minute segment of time. A key component of point counts is that they stay consistent in terms of location and method. So we have a spotting scope, and we have had a spotting scope on each quarterly set of point counts we've done here in the North Field of Simpson. So that is consistent. You can see the little stake behind them right now that marks the point of this point count. We navigated to it with a GPS, but there's actually a stake here marking it. So putting them near landmarks or marking them with a stake or being very careful with GPS to make sure you get on the right point is consistent both method and location for point counts. So consistency is key with point counts. Being very careful too to make sure you're timing it correctly, that it's 0 to 5, then 5 to 10, and documenting that start time. It's very important. Listening and looking in both directions. There's an ash sorter flycatcher calling behind us. So Olea is the primary observer. Determine that species, the number of them, and the distance. It's okay to discuss it as a group, but the decision is ultimately up to the primary observer. So what's mostly happening is Olea is mostly observing, calling out those birds, communicate that information to the data taker, who's then carefully documenting everything. And if something's missing, like Olea didn't say how many individuals, the data taker will ask. So as a team, you make sure you get all the information down that you need. So there's a yellow woodpecker. So it's up to the primary observer if that's a new bird or the same bird. Alright, so Olea's phone just signaled that that's the end of the first 5 minutes. And now she's going to restart that 5-minute timer. And the data taker will now note any new birds recorded are in the 5 to 10 minute range. Yeah, really careful because a lot of the birds you detected in that first 0 to 5 are still around, still calling, moving around. So you have to really pay very careful attention to document only new individuals. Carefully looking in all directions. Here on the north field of Simpson, our truncation distance, the limit of distance that birds are considered in for the survey, is quite long. It's 150 meters. I mean, this is pretty open country, as you can see. We can see quite far. That's why we have a scope as well. You can see pretty darn far, so what the truncation distance is for a specific site is going to be based on the properties of that site. And again, consistency is key, and this one is set at 150 meters truncation distance, and that's what we have it at. So both participants are looking around, but any judgment calls, decisions are going to be made by the primary observer. There's a tractor putt-putting across the road. It's the sort of thing where it's not really loud enough to stop the time, but we'd probably make a note about that disturbance. This is a note for the point count itself. It's okay to move a little bit from that point count center, so they're standing, a few feet away from the pole, and that's fine as long as you are staying pretty close to the pole and doing your distances from that point count center, not necessarily your location if you move slightly, but the way they've moved a little bit so they can see around that bush, it's totally fine. But you have to be keeping track of everything in terms of distances from that center point. Alright, well, his time just went off, so that is the end of 10 minutes. So then what we would do is move on to the next point count location with a set. And we can document birds we see in between points as supplemental birds. And we'll talk about how to do that on the data sheet in the next segment. And this sort of thing is very normal too, where they thought they heard something and they're going to confirm an ID once the time ends, because now you can move freely. And you can update IDs on the data form once the times end. That's totally fine. More information, the better. But so they're going to find this bird they detected during the survey. And then when we're done and ready, we'll move on to the next point. So that was a 10-minute intensive point count protocol point count. So filling out the data forms is a really key part of what happens in the field. And the protocol talks about how to fill out a data form, but seeing it visually can be so helpful. So I wanted to go over that quickly. So there's two main forms you have to know about. The first one here is the cover sheet, and this is a form that we use at Tucson Audubon and for the larger statewide Important Bird Areas program to identify every type of survey. So this is a form we use for no matter what the survey is. In some situations it can be optional, but it's important to know what information goes on this cover form to make sure if you don't use it that you capture some of that information on your more specific survey form. So it really leads you along this cover form, and it asks you some pretty basic questions. It wants to know the date, very important, the date of the survey. It wants to know who was there, the location, so where were you, what date were you there, the people who were there on the survey. It has some questions at the end about email address, agency, hours, and miles drived. And the reason it's asking that is because we often have a lot of grant tracking that happens with our surveys. A lot of them are led by volunteers. Or assisted by volunteers. So if it's a staff person and a volunteer, that can be very important for us to know exactly what agency they're with, the fact that they're an employee or maybe even a federal employee, which means it wouldn't be grant match in kind. But if they're a volunteer, then we need to keep track of all that. And we have a program that rewards our volunteers and makes sure that They get discounts in our shop to thank them, so we track their hours, but also it's very important for our grant reporting. So that's why it asks that. And then it has, so when it asks at the top survey location, we mean your general location. So if you're doing a route within Los Cienegos National Conservation Area, you're within Los Cienegos National Conservation Area as the survey location. It's kind of a broader location. And then down here it asks the transect name. So if you're doing, transect 2, this is where you put transect 2 within Los Cienegos. So that's, and then it has some places to fill in some weather information, as well as an area for site comments. So this is where you would put a comment about the general survey. It's very likely if I've sent you a digital version of this form or given you paper versions, but if not, they are available for download on the Arizona Important Bird Areas website, which is aziba.org. Just click on that resources tab, and one of the options that shows up is basic IBA data forms, and that's where this is. So you can get a digital version of this, but it's a really important, really helpful cover sheet for any survey you do. Now, if you're doing an intensive point count, this is the form that is for the actual point count itself. So this is what you're going to use. You're going to want to have multiple copies of this, because when you're doing your surveys, if it's more than one point count location, you go through these forms pretty quickly. So I wanted to go over some of the basic information and pitfalls that tend to occur while filling out this form. So this is our intensive point count form, and you can print these out. We tend to do ours here at Tucson Audubon on cover stock, just because we're out in the field using these in kind of some rugged areas. That's entirely optional. That's just our preference. But you really want to be pretty careful to use this form well. Now, I also want to point out that at Tucson Audubon, we do take some of the important information sheets and have attached them to our clipboards. So these sheets are also available in digital format on the Arizona Important Bird Areas webpage. But it has, you can see here, some of the breeding codes, habitat codes. These are very standardized, especially the breeding codes are the same codes you would see on eBird.org or Breeding Bird Atlas, so they're very, very standardized. And then we have some behavior codes on the back. And so this is if you want to make comments about, foraging in the air, if you're seeing swallows, that kind of thing. This is the code. So we have them here for quick reference, because it's pretty important that you get codes correct. If you're going to use codes, they need to be correct, or in retrospect, when you're back looking where someone else is looking at the data, you don't really know what the heck they meant if the code is incorrect, because there's so few letters. So as a general rule of thumb, if you're not sure what the code is, put more information in there rather than try to guess at a code, because if a code's wrong, that can be very, very troublesome. So avian intensive point count surveys, this sheet is designed so that if there's not a whole lot of birds going on, you can put multiple point counts on one sheet, or keep it sort of running into multiple sheets, so you don't have to start a new sheet with every point count location. And the sheet is designed this way. So how it works is you are first going to fill in the date and the start time, and we mean the start time of sort of the whole survey route. So if you're doing a trail that has, say, a dozen point count locations along it, it's sort of the start and end time at the top here for the whole session of surveying, not a specific point count. So let's say you start at 6 a.m. So the date, it's going to be, 02. You put the date, put the start time. Now it's really important that all this information at the top be filled out on your first sheet. It's very, very common to run into multiple sheets while doing a survey, especially if it's quite a birdy area. So we always number the sheets, and I don't have a space for that. So we, as sort of a logistics rule, we always put a 1, on our first sheet, and then at the end, knowing, at the end when we know how many total sheets we end up with, that's when we do, the of 6 or however many sheets it ends up being for your survey day. So you want to fit on the date, the start time, the observers and the recorders. Now this is quite this. The protocol covers this, but it's pretty important to keep track of who's the primary observer and who is the recorder. Now, it can be one person. One person can do the whole thing, and that's actually quite common in a point count survey study, is to just have sort of one person doing all of it. But it's also very common, especially for us here at Tucson Audubon, to have a team, two people, an observer and a recorder. The observer, narrating what they're seeing, and the recorder jotting it all down. Knowing which is which can be important if there's follow-up questions on looking at data. So you have to put in the names of the observer, the recorder, the location, the primary habitat, and that's why part of the reason we keep these codes on the clipboard of habitat type. And then it has some weather questions at the top. So this sheet has a lot of the questions on a cover sheet integrated into the sheet itself. Some of our other survey forms don't do this as much, so this is why I say for an intensive point count, the cover sheet can be pretty optional, since a lot of the same information is captured here. So it's got some weather information, and it even talks you through some of the codes. So it has the Beaufort wind codes described here right on the sheet, as well as the sky weather codes and precipitation codes. So it's really giving you a lot of the information you're going to need for recording the weather is right there on the sheet. And then it has a little bit of space, and this is sort of to put any comments. Okay, so it's got 2 blank lines for comments, and then it's giving you some information too. It's telling you some distance parameters that it wants you to be utilizing, and this is a big difference for an intensive point count and a regular point count that we tend to use here in the IBA program, which has much wider bands of distance. But this is a distance that, so as in the closer distances, they're quite narrow. It has 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. This is all in meters, and it does say that. 40 to 50, and then they get more broad, 50 to 75, 75 to 100, and then 1 to 125, 125 to 150. Now, this is based on the assumption that your survey is going to have a truncation distance of 150 meters. A lot of the intensive point counts that we do at Tucson Audubon, that is indeed the case, because they're open fields and you can see quite far. So if that does not work for your purposes, you can certainly change that, or just maintain. If you write 125 to 150, that could just be considered a supplemental observation, and it's not within the boundaries of your survey. But this form does accommodate that. And then we have an FO option, and it just even describes it here, and the protocol talks about this quite a lot, but it goes over it again because it is pretty important. So it's a flyover, FO, flyover, within the survey truncation zone, but not foraging. So because these are point counts, flyovers generally count if it seems to you as the surveyor that the bird is utilizing the airspace over the point count location. So if it's swallows flying around above you foraging, or a red-tailed hawk circling like it's looking for prey, and it feels like it's utilizing the airspace above your survey area, that's considered in for the survey. Now, so an FO would be a bird that just keeps going. It's like just moving through your space, not really utilizing the habitat, just sort of traveling through it to get from one point to another. So that's a pretty important distinction. And then S being supplemental is another code that it explains there. So it also explains really well, this is a really nicely put together form, that M is male, F is female, adult, subadult, less than 1 year old is a juvenile. So, and then it also has some breeding behavior codes, some things for calling, singing, and then whether it was detected within 0 to 5 or 5 to 10. So you need to fill out the location, primary habitat. Secondary habitat is sort of optional, but it can be very helpful in some situations if there is a second habitat that can be influencing what's going on for your survey. And then I want you to document your truncation distance. So if you decide, okay, I'm in dense vegetation, I need to cut this off at 100, you can document that there. And then you're ready to start. So it's very common for us doing our survey to be walking towards our first point, and then we may be detecting birds along the way. I tend to be very supplement documenting heavy. Some people much less so. I like supplemental documentations. There's no right or wrong to this because they all sort of go in the same extra list. But I like keeping track of interesting and unusual birds that I see between and before and after point counts. So I tend to do this quite a lot. But how you do that is, so it has a column here for point, it has a column for species, A/V, meaning audio or visual, count, and then a place you can check where if you estimated that count. So it says EST for estimation, distance, and this is, we made this quite a long box so you could fill in those 10 to 20 or 40 to 50, whatever it is. And then it has a 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 column. This is because intensive point counts are 10 minutes long, but we do keep track of what birds are detected in the 0 to 5 minute block and then the 5 to 10 minute block. Now, birds you find in the 5 to 10 minute block that you detect again in the 5 to 10 minute block need to be completely ignored. This is only for new, you're only going to record new birds as time goes on through that 10 minutes. So, and then it has an MFASJ, and this is where you can then put numbers indicating what, if the breakdown of your total count, how many of them are male, female, adult, subadult, and juvenile. These are often left blank, but when you can tell, I had 2 cardinals, it's a male and a female, this is where you can put a 2 here on the count, and then 1 in the M and 1 in the F column, 1 male, 1 female. Now, it's only if you can tell in the field. If you know, if it's an audio detection, you don't necessarily know that. But, and then it has here a habitat column, and this is not filled out very often. This is where if you're seeing a bird and you need to indicate a specific habitat, like an unusual bird, and it's a habitat that's different from the primary habitat you listed at the top, this is where you can fill that out, put in a habitat comment, or indicate a different habitat. We have a veg SPA column, and this is to indicate if your bird that you observed is utilizing a specific plant. This is where you can document that. Now we have snag, because our study was very interested in whether snags were being used. So if the bird is using a snag, you can go ahead and check mark that there. Alternately, if something else is more important in your study and you have the digital version of this form, you could change that potentially to something else. I have GB and BB, and this is, GB is for general behavior. So those are those codes on the back of my clipboard. Things like foraging, perching, hunting. Those are general behavior codes. Behaviors that have nothing to do with breeding. And then BB for breeding code, or breeding behavior, excuse me. And it does say this up on the form that what these GB and BB stand for. And then we have a box here to check for calling, CA for calling, SI for singing. And the reason we do that, because you could just put an SI under the breeding bird code, but with point counts, especially in a good habitat or in the spring or something, birds can come thick and fast. Like you can get a primary observer just like rapid speed talking basically the birds they're seeing, and it can be very difficult, to try to capture all that information quickly. So that's why we have a sing thing here, so you can check that quickly and indicate whether they're singing or calling. And then we have a comment box at the end, and this is to put a comment about a specific observation. So let's just put in some observations here as a sort of a sample survey that I'm going to narrate. So we're walking to our first point, and we saw an interesting, like a loggerhead shrike sitting off to the side. So our point is 0-1 to indicate that it's from 0 to 1, so between 0 and 1 is how we tend to do this. Then we have species code. This is pretty wide. Many of observers are very knowledgeable on 4-letter banding codes for birds. If you are less knowledgeable about that, I suggest you use the 6-letter code system. So that would be the first, if it's a bird that has 2 words as its name, like loggerhead shrike, you would do the first 3 letters of each word. So if you're not sure, go with the 6-letter system, but if you do know the 4-letter codes, go ahead, or use any sort of standardized abbreviation. Like northern cardinal, you could do N period card, and that's very clear that it's a northern cardinal. Just try to make sure that you're not going to be confused later by what species you did a code for. So we have loggerhead shrikes, and that's LOSH for a 4-letter code. Put that down. It was a visual. There is no both in point counts. There is in other survey types, but you want to record how you first detected the bird. So if it's, we saw it sitting over there and then later we hear it vocalizing, that's still a visual because we spotted it first visually. Now, that can be different in transects, but there is no both. I didn't both see it and hear it in a point count. You want to document the first detection way. It's 1 bird. I did not estimate. I have an accurate count, so I'm going to leave that blank. And it's sitting from, I estimate 30 to 40 meters. And it's in, I'm going to ignore the 0 to 5, 5 to 10 since it's a supplemental bird. It's not on a point count yet. Okay, so then I keep going. We reach our established point count location for point 1. I'm going to skip a line. That's how we do it as a best practice. I'm going to skip a line, and now we're at point 1. I'm going to put a 1 there in the column to indicate that we've started the point of point 1. And then it's a bit of a strange thing. Now, we've just gotten used to this over the year, but there's no column for time. So we always just write the start time next to where we indicated that this is whatever point number it is. So let's say our survey started at 6 is when we started walking to our first point, and we've reached point 1 by 6:05. So I'll put 6:05 right next to the 1. That's how we do this form here at Tucson Audubon. And then we start putting our birds in. So let's say we had a Verdin, he was an audio 1, I had a lesser goldfinch, visual 5, but it was a flock moving and I couldn't really tell, so I estimated 5, so I'm going to check the estimate box. The distance on that Verdin was 10 to 20. The Legos, the lesser goldfinches, were 40 to 50. And then that's it. After 5 minutes, that's all we've had. So I'm going to mark those as 0 to 5. We tend to just do a line through it, but 0 to 5. And then we keep going, and oh, there's a new bird, a red-tailed hawk. I didn't see him before. It just landed on that perch. So we're going to do red-tailed hawk. It's visual 1. He's pretty far. He's 50 to 75 meters. You want to literally write out the numbers for your distance. And now I have some eastern meadowlarks. The Lillian's meadowlarks have been calling out in that field over there. So that'd be, put the code, eastern meadowlark. It's an audio. It sounds like quite a few, so I'm going to go with 8. I'm going to check estimate because I'm estimating 8 based on the audio. And they seem pretty far, so I'll say 100 to 125. And then my timer goes off, and the second session of 5 minutes is ended for a total of 10 minutes. So then those go in the 5 to 10. So that's how we do it. And you can also just do check boxes too, but I tend to just put a line through them when the minutes are over for the first 5 minutes and then the second 5 minutes, indicating what birds we saw and which. There's a couple reasons we do this. One is that if we ever needed to, we could normalize this data to a 5-minute point count if we wanted to compare it to something else. So that point's over. We're walking to the next point. So I skip a line, and then if we do get birds along the way, you don't always, but if or anything that you feel like you want to note. But if you do see a bird along the way you want to note, you put that as 1-2 because it's between point 1 and 2. And then you'd put your birds. Let's say we had a white-winged dove. Visual 1. Okay, so I don't worry about doing distance so much on a supplemental bird. You can fill it in. Our system will accommodate you indicating that. So let's say I do know it's 10 to 20, and go ahead and put that. These are clearly supplemental birds because I have that that 1 to 2. 1-2 is between points. Now you could always put a comment as supplemental if you want to make it very, very clear. So then we get to our second point. I'm going to skip a line again, put a 2. This is point 2. I'm going to put the time. It's now 6:25. Write that next to it, next to that 2, and then start filling in your birds. So it's pretty important that you number your pages. Very, very important, since you can sort of do point counts going down the whole page. You want to number your pages. That's really quite important. Now, indicating the time also helps if you didn't number them at the time to put them in the correct order. But I do, at the very end of a survey, often how we do ours is we walk out to a point. We do a whole series, like a route of points, and then you reach an end zone and you have to kind of walk all the way back to the vehicle. That may not be the case in your situation, but that's how it works for us. So I tend to be, once I've done my last point count, official 10-minute survey, I tend to put a big squiggly line on the data form and then note interesting birds we see walking back, and then it's very, very clear that the survey ended. And I may even then put end and note the time. Let's say it was 9:30 when we ended, put the 9:30, so that I remember to then go back to that first page. Or if it's, I'm sitting down to enter the data, I'm like, oh my gosh, what time did the survey end? Because the first page is where you should have filled out your name, location, the survey start and end time. But page 1 is going to be at the back of your stack by this point. So this is why I tend to write the end time on the last page as well, in case so I have it for reference to put it back on page 1 when the time comes. Another helpful thing to keep in mind for data entry is when we've done these in the field and they've come back, I tend to go through them pretty carefully. I make sure everything looks good, make sure the pages are in order, I staple them, and then I tend to take a highlighter and highlight the birds that are supplemental, because it can be, when you get in the zone of data entry, sometimes you can go over the end of a point count and accidentally put in a supplemental bird. I have a special handout of information for doing data entry on our online system for the Arizona Important Bird Areas database, but point counts, each specific point count is going to be its own survey entry on the online system, which makes sense because they're all separate surveys. And then all the supplementals will get put together on one supplemental online survey, with notes on whether they were before the survey, whether they were between point 1 and 2, or whatever the situation was. There's a way to indicate that, but all the supplementals go together on one list. So I tend to highlight them with like a yellow highlighter or something, so I don't accidentally, it visually flags me not to enter them as part of an actual point count, since they were not. So the form, I think, is pretty straightforward, but if you have any questions, please certainly do let me know. My contact information is on the Arizona IBA website, or you can just contact me through Tucson Audubon Society. So thank you so much, and I hope you have fun doing your intensive point counts.